human rights and transitional justice in Sri Lanka. As many of you know, I co-chair this caucus with my good friend Danny Davis. The focus of this caucus is to increase awareness and educate on the protection of rights and identity of all ethnicities and religions in Sri Lanka who are being excluded from society, the economy, and political life through discrimination, harassment, and persecution. Since we started the caucus back in 2013, some progress has been made to increase democratic principles and restore human rights for all Sri Lankans, notably due to the election of the Sirisena government in 2015. However, there is considerable work that must be done before those rights are fully restored, work which the Sirisena government has committed to accomplish by co-sponsoring Resolution 30-1 at the UN Human Rights Council in 2015. In March, at the most recent session of the UN Human Rights Council, Sri Lanka received a 2-year extension to fulfill their commitments for transitional justice. However, the UN High Commissioner called on Sri Lanka for speedier and more meaningful implementation of these promised reforms. I certainly agree that continued progress is critical. Transitional justice and accountability for past war crimes and a more transparent government inclusive of all Sri Lankans are necessary steps for moving forward. As many of you also know, Sri Lanka has recently been the unfortunate victim of a tragic series of bombings which occurred at Catholic churches and in hotels in Sri Lanka's capital, Colombo, on Easter Sunday. While we do not have all the facts as to how and why these attacks occurred, it is clear that this senseless violence claimed the lives of hundreds of innocent people and injured hundreds more. Many of these victims were Sri Lankans practicing their faith on the most holy day of the Christian calendar. It is also clear that these attacks were against Sri Lankans as a whole. It was indiscriminate killing. They were not perpetrated against one ethnicity or another. I'm very pleased that the United States is offering the Sri Lankan government our full support in their efforts to hold accountable those behind the attacks and to restore safety and freedoms for all of its citizens. As Ambassador Teplitz has stated, unity is the most powerful answer to terrorism. And let me turn now, because I've got to go down to the floor, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to give it over to my colleague Danny Davis to make his comments. I am going to butcher these names, but I'm going to try. First, we are fortunate to have Canadian Member of Parliament Gary Anandasangari. Do I have that close?
Very close.
Very close. On our panel today, in addition to serving as the Member of Parliament for Scarborough, Rouge Park, and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage and Multiculturalism, Gary is an internationally recognized human rights lawyer and community activist. He is a passionate advocate for human rights issues, regularly representing Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada at the United Nations Human Rights Council. He's also demonstrated leadership at a number of organizations and has served as the chair of the Canadian Tamil Youth Development Center and president of the Canadian Tamils Chamber of Commerce. Gary came to Canada with his mother as a refugee in 1983 and has advocated for the rights of refugees throughout his adult life. Next, we're fortunate to hear from Mr. Juan Mendez, professor of human rights law in residence at the American University Washington College of Law. A native of Argentina, Mr. Mendez has dedicated his legal career to the defense of human rights and has a long and distinguished record of advocacy throughout the Americas. As of November 2010, he was appointed to the UN Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment or punishment. He was also the special advisor to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and co-chair of the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute. For 15 years, he also worked with Human Rights Watch, concentrating his efforts on human rights issues in the Western Hemisphere. Mr. Mendez is a member of the Bar of Mar del Plata and Buenos Aires, Argentina, and the District of Columbia. Next, we will hear from Ms. Danica Damplo. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Who works as an analyst at the Universal Rights Group, New York City, a human rights project located at the Ralph Bunche Institute at CUNY Graduate Center. Danica focuses on several projects, including transitional justice, the relationship between the Human Rights Council and the Security Council, and the United Nations Sustaining Peace Agenda. Prior to joining URG, Danica worked as a research officer supporting the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on Truth, Justice, Reparation, and Guarantees of Non-Recurrence, and before that, she worked with several nonprofits, including Independent Diplomat, a diplomatic advisory nonprofit in New York. Danica holds a Master of Science in International Affairs from London School of Economics, a Master of Science in International Affairs from Peking University, and a BA in Political Science and History from Columbia University. Last but certainly not least, we will hear from Mr. Francisco Bencosme.
Right.
Get that right?
100%.
100%. Who is the Asia Pacific Advocacy Manager at Amnesty International USA. Francisco has testified before Congress and provided media commentary on multiple outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Before joining Amnesty International, he served as a professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he assisted senators on issues related to East Asia and the Pacific, South Asia, and State Department USAID oversight. Francisco received his Master of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University, a graduate certificate from the U.S. Air Force Air University, and his BA from Wake Forest University. I'm Air Force myself, so that's a plus in my book. And so to our panelists, let me say welcome. And now would you please welcome my dear friend and colleague, Danny Davis, who shares the same passions I do for the people of Sri Lanka. Danny, over to you.
Thank you very much, and let me welcome all of you to this hearing. I also want to thank my friend and colleague for the work that he does and the interest that he shows. Many people ask me, why am I involved with Sri Lanka? I represent 720,000 or so people in the city of Chicago, in and around. There aren't very many individuals in my district who've come from Sri Lanka. I don't know anybody who really lives there too much now. But I've been involved with the issue and concerns now, I guess for about 15 years or so. And I've come to know the individuals who brought me to the table and who asked me if I would become involved. We've become great personal friends. As a matter of fact, their passion, their sense of engagement has brought me to the point where I'm eager to say that I simply love them. They have become friends of mine to the point, generally when you represent people, you look for them to vote for you and all those I don't look for any of that. Folks in my district vote for me. They've done so now for more than 20 years. Some of the wealthiest people in the world, some of the poorest people in America with every kind of issue and problem. As a matter of fact, we had 20 people OD in a community that I represent last week. 4 of them died, but I still find time to be involved. I've visited Sri Lanka. I've been there. I kind of saw the country, beautiful, beautiful country. Issues and problems like most places in the world. So now that I've introduced myself, let me just read what Caleb has prepared. And I want to thank Caleb for the diligence and the work that he puts in on this issue and the concerns that we come into contact with as it relates to us. On April 21st, Easter Sunday, there were a series of coordinated bomb attacks on Sri Lanka's Christian churches and hotels by terrorists, unfortunately killing 253 people and injuring 500 others. These attacks were some of the most deadly on this island since the end of the Civil War 10 years ago. The Sri Lankan government is still investigating these attacks as to how and why they occurred. At this time, the situation in Sri Lanka is very fluid. The issue of human rights abuses is still before the U.S. Commission for Human Rights, and there is a need for the United States to continue influencing Sri Lanka to follow through on the promises it made to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The United Nations Human Rights Council's report of March 22nd, 2019 on the Sri Lankan government's promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism revealed concern that the continuing systemic use of torture, ill treatment, and conditions people are subject to during detention. Also, the report discusses the slow movement and delay of transitional justice measures the Sri Lankan government promises to do back in 2015. Given the Sri Lanka human rights challenges and the importance to move forward from the end of the Civil War in 2009 is more challenging due to past and recent events. The National Tawhid Jamaat, a local and small Islamic terrorist group, the Sri Lankan government implicated in the coordination of several bombing attacks on churches and hotels in Sri Lanka and continuing to further investigate this matter. The appointment of Major General Shavendra Silva as the Army Chief of Staff for the #2 position in the Sri Lankan Army. Sylvia has been accused of war crimes, and his appointment appears to send a very clear message about Sri Lanka's resistance to condemning war crimes committed during the war. The land issues affecting both the Tamils and Muslims. Sinhalese settlers are encroaching on lands occupied and owned by both Tamils and Muslims. This encroachment has increased over the last 2 years and is an issue that could lead to an increase in violence in the country. Radical Sinhalese nationalism poses a serious threat to the stability of Sri Lanka as well. The Buddha Bala, BBS, and other groups have actively and violently challenged Muslims, Christians, and Tamils. These groups have been closely associated with the Rajapaksa family and its supporters. The rise to power has increased the possibility of increased violence against most groups, such as the anti-Muslim riots of last spring. Development has been neglected in the Tamil and Muslim areas. The U.S. government should provide more support and pressure to aid agencies in order to address the needs of the north and east of Sri Lanka. USAID should work to offset the Sinhalese bias in the placement of development projects and their implementation. And moreover, the U.S. should work to pressure the UNDP and other international agencies to increase aid to these areas. these are just a few of the challenges that are currently being faced. I thank all of the witnesses for coming in to share with us what they know about the situations, what they feel about the situations. And I hope that our government, that is the United States government, would become more interested, more engaged, and more involved in helping to find solutions to these issues. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And I guess we'll just start down on the end and move any way we stop.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Davis and Johnson. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to Congressional Caucus on Ethnic and Religious Freedoms in Sri Lanka for this opportunity to speak today. I want to first acknowledge the victims and all their families of the incidents that took place on Easter Sunday, and certainly the long and painful war in the last 35 years. And of course, I want to thank the leadership of the United States, especially the Human Rights Council, since 2009, and the leadership towards the successive resolutions that ensued as a result of your country's leadership. Leadership from the United States is essential in these difficult times, and I regret that your country has withdrawn from one of the most important international forums in the world, namely the United Nations Human Rights Council. I've been engaged with the UN Human Rights Council since 2009, the end of the conflict in Sri Lanka, initially as a member of the Tamil Civil Society representing an organization called Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada, and more recently as a member of Parliament in Canada representing the constituency of Scarborough Rouge Park. At the 34th session that concluded in March of this year, I appeared at the Council and participated in its deliberations. Today I appear before you in my own capacity as a Canadian Member of Parliament and not representing the Government of Canada in any formal manner. I will, however, focus my remarks on the issue of accountability as a cornerstone for transitional justice, and in particular addressing the following three issues. First, the need to end impunity and secure accountability. Second, the role of the international community in addressing accountability. And three, recent developments on the island and the need for decisive leadership. First, 10 years ago this month, Sri Lanka's brutal 26-year-old conflict came to an end with violations of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. In 2012, the United Nations Human Rights Council, led by the United States, established an investigation into allegations of violations of international human rights and humanitarian law under the auspices of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. In 2015, the OHCHR reported its findings to the United Nations Human Rights Council and established that war crimes and crimes against humanity have in fact taken place in Sri Lanka. The crime of genocide was outside the scope of the investigation, and as such, no finding was made by the OHCHR. However, further investigation was deemed to be warranted. At the conclusion of the OHCHR report, Resolution 30-1 was passed by consent of the Sri Lankan state, which amongst other matters committed to establishing a hybrid court to investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate violations of international law. Sri Lanka agreed to invite foreign and Commonwealth investigators, prosecutors, lawyers, and judges to partake in this hybrid court, and agreed to establish laws that would domesticate international human rights and humanitarian law, including the war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of genocide. In 2017, due to lack of progress on accountability, Sri Lanka sought and received a 2-year extension to undertake and complete its commitments under the initial resolution in 2015, namely 30-1. Again, with very limited progress in 2019 March, 30-1 was rolled over for a further 2-year period. The Sri Lankan government has failed to abide by its commitments under 30-1 and in fact have gone back on its word. It's clear that the president has vowed to protect the military personnel at all costs. It is really no Proactive measures have been taken in Sri Lanka, including in the introduction of draft legislation with respect to domesticating international crimes. In effect, it has squandered the opportunity to advance accountability, peace, and reconciliation on the island. It is in this context that the role of the international community is very important, and brings me to my second point. Given the unwillingness and inability of the Sri Lankan government to take concrete steps towards accountability, the role of the international community is vital. The war in Sri Lanka was won without international witnesses. The UN panel of experts in 2011 established serious failures on the part of the international community, including the United Nations. Regrettably, the conflict that resulted in the demise of over 100,000 people had very little attention in the international arena. With the exception of a resolution in 1989 at the former United Nations Human Rights Commission, no other resolutions were made at any of the UN bodies, including the United Nations Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, or the Security Council during the period of the war. In effect, the impunity that we often speak of relating to intra-Sri Lanka issues was extended by the international community to Sri Lanka as a state. Just like Myanmar and its treatment of the Rohingyas, Sri Lanka and others have enjoyed international impunity. In the absence of Sri Lanka providing and abiding by a time-bound strategy to implement 30-1 within the 2-year time extension granted, Sri Lanka must be held to account. Sri Lanka needs to see that the international community is watching, and here are some options I think the international community should consider in this context. First, this matter should be taken to the General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council, and ultimately be referred to the International Criminal Court. Secondly, as per the recommendations of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, each country, and particularly the United States, should exercise universal jurisdiction to prosecute international crimes of Sri Lankan nationals who have been accused of such. The Magnitsky Act allows for seizure of property and other assets of citizens believed to have violated certain laws, and I think it's appropriate to invoke it in this manner. Implement travel bans on those who are part of the chain of command in Sri Lanka over the course of the conflict, and utilize civil remedies as per the 2 cases filed for the International Truth and Justice Project in California recently. Other bi- and multilateral options are to be explored and exercised with like-minded countries and co-sponsors. These options are to be explored and invoked by the United States and other countries in the event that Sri Lanka fails to fully implement 30-1. The recent developments in Sri Lanka are very worrisome. The Easter Sunday bomb blast at 3 churches and the 3 hotels have shocked the observers and those who follow Sri Lanka very closely. However, the seeds of religious hatred and violence were sowed a long time ago. In fact, I would argue Sri Lanka's constitution offers a glimpse of the religious hegemony that exists, which places Buddhism as the primary religion of the state. And I just want to quote part of the constitution. It says, "The Republic of Sri Lanka shall give to Buddhism the foremost place, and accordingly it shall be the duty of the state to protect and foster the Buddha Sasana while assuring to all religions the rights granted by Articles 10 and 14. And I would argue the latter have not been done appropriately by the Sri Lankan state. In 2018, we saw anti-Muslim riots in parts of the island. In 2018, the National Christian Evangelical Alliance of Sri Lanka reported 67 attacks on Christian churches between just January and September alone. The north and east, we have seen a plethora of new Buddhist monuments take shape in primarily Hindu, Christian, and Muslim areas. Religious plurality was never established on the island, and in fact, it is apparent to anyone who has traveled that there are very few attempts to respect and give agency to religious minorities. While the full extent of the lapses have not been revealed on the surface, it would appear that the Sri Lankan government grossly failed to protect its own citizens last week. In fact, in law, it would be tantamount to willful blindness. The fallout of this is quite problematic. First, increased powers were given to the police and other military personnel. It's banned headgear that targets Muslim women in particular. There's increased level of mistrust against Muslims, closure of churches and mosques during Sunday Mass and Friday Jummah. General sense that we've gone backward in time. And of course, we see wartime curfews and targeting of journalists, whether it's through online hate or through direct threats, the creation of a registry for Muslims, and widespread media censorship. Sri Lanka requires decisive leadership and the will to essentially build confidence in order they can get back on track. In conclusion, I think the recent events in Sri Lanka highlight the core issues and challenges that plague the country that foster impunity and hinder accountability. The international community must continue to exert pressure on Sri Lanka and must be seized with the matter. Timing is critical, and we cannot allow Sri Lanka to use recent events to take a hard line on dissent. The United States needs to continue to play a leading role, and as before, I believe the United States leadership has been critical in order to advance the issues of accountability, peace, justice, and reconciliation. I look forward to the questions and comments, and I want to thank my co-panelists for being here, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Congressman Davis, Congressman Johnson, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to brief the caucus on the issues of torture and ill treatment in Sri Lanka. In the light of the tragic attacks on innocents of the last few days, it is especially important for the caucus to insist that Sri Lanka must strengthen protections against abuse if it is ever to overcome the ethnic and religious discrimination that, throughout the country's life as an independent nation, has been the background to very severe atrocities. I visited Sri Lanka in 2016 as my last country mission in my capacity as United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture. As I mentioned in the report that I submitted to the Human Rights Council in early 2017, the government of Sri Lanka had invited me, and it honored its commitment to allow me full access to victims, witnesses, detention centers in the whole country, and interviews with high-ranking officials. As far as I've been able to ascertain, the persons who spoke with me did not suffer adverse repercussions on that account. Unfortunately, it was my overall observation that the end of the war with the Tamil Tigers in 2009 had not signified an end also to legal or unlawful restrictions on the exercise of public freedoms by all Sri Lankan citizens. In particular, criminal investigations by 2016 were still conducted with a high degree of arbitrariness and brutality by both the Criminal Investigation Division, CID, and the Terrorism Investigation Division, TID, the branches of law enforcement that are in charge of arrests and interrogations for purposes of criminal prosecutions. Despite denials by government authority, there were still credible reports of, quote, white van abductions, end quote, by officers in plain clothes. My inquiries also revealed that often the torture methods involved sexual and gender-based violence, allegations that were frequently supported by forensic medical examinations. These and other cases of torture were not investigated, prosecuted, or punished in violation of Sri Lanka's obligations under international law. While the practice of torture was less prevalent than during the long armed conflict, a culture of torture still persisted in 2016. Despite the recommendations I included in my report to the effect of breaking the cycle of impunity for torture and instituting serious safeguards against it, not much seems to have been done in that regard. Specifically, I urge the government to ensure that all arrests are properly registered from the very moment of deprivation of freedom, in order to prevent the practice of secret detention for hours, days, and even weeks before bringing a person to the courts, which evidently promotes interrogation with brutal methods to obtain confessions. The Prevention of Terrorism Act has survived the 2011 lifting of the state of emergency. The act allows arrest without warrant and detention of up to 72 hours before the person is brought before a magistrate. It also allows the Ministry of Defense to detain persons for up to 18 months with judicial supervision of the conditions of detention, but without jurisdiction to challenge the legality of the detention order. At the time of my visit there, there was a proposal to allow access to a lawyer from the very moment of loss of freedom, a safeguard that the Special Rapporteurs on Torture always insist upon as the most effective protection against ill treatment everywhere in the world. But the CID and the TID objected to this proposal, and it was not instituted. Instead, in August of 2016, a few weeks after my visit, the Sri Lanka Gazette published a proposal that deprives a detainee of access to a lawyer until after his or her initial statement has been recorded. To their credit, the National Human Rights Commission and several civil society organizations publicly objected to these proposed regulations. I found that the periodic hearings before a magistrate, as contemplated in the relevant procedural norms, were not effective against torture. Magistrates routinely rubber-stamp detention orders made by the executive branch and seldom, if ever, inquired into the health and safety of detainees or into the conditions of detention to which they were subjected. In addition, court proceedings are long and drawn out, so that I had the occasion of interviewing prisoners accused under the Prevention of Terrorism Act who had spent 10 years on remand without having been tried or convicted. After 2009, more than 12,000 persons were subjected to detention and rehabilitation, some of them arrested after the end of the war. By 2016, all but around 40 of them had been released, and only one rehabilitation center remained in operation. And a few individuals accused of membership in the Tamil Tigers remained in custody without trial. Although I have no confirmation, I assume that by now this form of prolonged arbitrary detention has ceased altogether. On the other hand, I received credible information that many rehabilitated prisoners, quote unquote, remained under surveillance and were harassed and threatened by state agents even years after their release. Although Sri Lanka has instituted a moratorium on executions, as recommended by the United Nations, the death penalty has not been abolished. At the time of my visit, 462 prisoners were held in death row in abject conditions in separate wings of 2 prisons. The uncertainty of their fate and the isolation of or severe restriction on human contact imposed on them amounts to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. In 2016, 56% of about 17,000 prisoners were on remand, or their convictions were on appeal. The majority then have not been actually found to be guilty of a crime. Although there were no figures for the actual capacity of Sri Lankan prisons, I did observe several prisons that were extremely overcrowded and in states of severe decay and deficient infrastructure. There was an acute lack of sleeping accommodation, with several inmates sleeping in staircases or corridors, extreme heat and insufficient ventilation, and severely unsanitary conditions. There was very limited medical or dental care and an absence of recreational activities or educational opportunities. I was especially struck by the insufficiency of judicial safeguards against arbitrary detention and safeguards to prevent torture or coercion during initial questioning. Although torture and arbitrary arrest are forbidden by the Constitution and laws of Sri Lanka, custody hearings are ineffective as a means for magistrates to examine the legality of arrest or the treatment of a person detained. Judges and prosecutors remained adhered to a passive, old-fashioned procedure that makes them rely for the decisions almost totally on evidence gathered by the police, and more specifically on confessions. Despite the exclusionary rule that is binding on Sri Lanka as a matter of international law, the criminal justice system still admits confessions without corroboration and without an attempt to examine whether they were freely and voluntarily rendered. Statements made to a senior police officer are fully admissible in court under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Most significantly, there are no effective investigations of allegations of torture. Lack of accountability for torture and ill treatment can only result in encouragement of unlawful and immoral practices. The Sri Lanka government supported the adoption by the United Nations Human Rights Council of Resolution 30-1, calling for a policy to address a legacy of widespread and serious human rights violations that took place during the lengthy armed conflict. At the time of my visit, more than 6 years after the end of the war, there were various proposals to implement transitional justice mechanisms intended to fulfill the legitimate expectations of all Sri Lankan people to the truth, justice, reparations for victims, and to measures of non-repetition. Unfortunately, those policies have not been approved or implemented, and Sri Lankans and the international community still await the announcement of measures to bring some transparency and accountability to the still open wounds left in the fabric of society by abuses that constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity. The cowardly and tragic attack on churches and hotels of the recent days only make this need for transparency and accountability more urgent than ever. The Sri Lankan state and society will only be able to defeat this hatred and violence if it provides itself with a legitimacy and trust that can be generated by those transitional justice means that are still waiting to be implemented. Thank you very much for your attention.
I could probably just speak like this. But, hello, and I'd like to thank the caucus for the invitation and for holding this really important event. I've been working on Sri Lanka for a few years now, and when the UN Special Rapporteur on Truth, Justice, Reparation and Guarantees of Non-Reoccurrence visited Sri Lanka as part of his country visit, I was able to accompany him, although I cannot speak the details of that visit as the report has not been made public, but the final statement at the end of that trip is available on OHHR's website and provides a good initial assessment of the situation. I also accompanied the Special Rapporteur when we held a regional consultation, the first in Asia, on transitional justice. And I did want to raise that in part because I think when people think about transitional justice, there's largely a sense that this is something in South Africa or South America, and yet we encountered people from many different countries in Asia who had undergone transitional justice processes in part or in whole, and there's a wealth of information and a wealth of resources and expertise in the region in which Sri Lanka sits that would be available, that would be incredibly useful for the government and the situation. I think the resources and expertise do not always have to come from the UN or from developed states outside the region, just as a bit of a side note. So I would, we've already heard about the developments on Sri Lanka at Human Rights Council, but I'll just elaborate a little bit on some of the areas where they have some significance. So what became known as the OISL report, the OHHR's investigation, is quite a significant document for the Human Rights Council as well as for Sri Lanka. It was a very thorough report, and now I think in many ways is sort of what solidifies this very strong interest at the Council in pursuing this, pursuing accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka, and continues to sort of form that impetus there. And the Resolution 30-1, which is the resolution that includes over 25 pledges and commitments by the government of Sri Lanka to implement transitional justice and to address the root causes of other grievances, is also quite significant for the Council to have the country in question co-sponsor this resolution, and it was passed unanimously. And country resolutions are not always passed unanimously, so this was definitely seen as a moment in which Sri Lanka was re-engaging with the international community and being interested in having that level of engagement after a period of complete disengagement. But it was a very different, if you've watched the session that just happened last month, where there was a second renewal of the resolution, it was a very different kind of setting. And I would actually preface it because when the US left the Human Rights Council, a lot of people who follow Sri Lanka were quite concerned because the US had been a very strong advocate on Sri Lanka at the Council, and there were concerns that this would fall off the agenda or they would not be able to get the same kind of results. But instead what we saw was the UK in particular, but also a number of countries who had not regularly been champions, who stepped forward and really pushed for this resolution to come through, even when it appeared that even the Sri Lankan delegation was a little unsure about whether they wanted to proceed. And that is, again, quite unique, and I think the Human Rights Council has had 2 very successful sessions without the US actually, where a lot of smaller states are coming forward and really kind of speaking with one voice on this issue. And so I think it's important to note, A, that this was the next resolution with a lot more urgent tone during the interactive dialogue from states is definitely something the Council appears committed to. At the same time, I don't think it's ever a good idea to not continue to insist that the Council keep Sri Lanka on the agenda until it answers what it has already committed to. And that, I think, we've seen with the Council, basically it doing what it's intended to do, identifying violations, monitoring the situation, and then assisting the government in its capacity to restore human rights and to answer in its own commitments. And so I think that will continue to be definitely a focus for the Council. But again, things can change, and especially at the Human Rights Council, and it's always important to keep Sri Lanka on the agenda and within the focus of the Council until it answers the commitments that it has made. I think it was also interesting that the High Commissioner for Human Rights, she delivered her report on the situation in Sri Lanka and spoke very specifically about several areas. And firstly, and this is very true, Sri Lanka has engaged significantly with human rights mechanisms of the Council and the UN. Many special rapporteurs and independent experts and working groups have come to Sri Lanka and then delivered reports. The area where there's that is less clear, as is in the case of many countries, but also here, is in the follow-up to those recommendations. And so the High Commissioner really did suggest a focus on that as well, and a process of ensuring that there is follow-up to many of the great advice and technical expertise that has been lent to Sri Lanka on not just transitional justice, but again, answering a lot of these root causes and grievances. She also, I mean, if you look at all of the country reports that are given by the High Commissioners over the last few years, you do see persistent issues that aren't being addressed that they bring up. The PTA, for example, continues to be something that is raised by High Commissioners. And I think what you come away with is also the fact that without additional pressure, even though the Human Rights Council seems very committed to keeping Sri Lanka on the agenda, the approach by the government of having a sort of minimalist approach is increasingly not satisfactory to members of the Council, and certainly, I would think, not satisfactory to the people of Sri Lanka either. But without additional pressure, it's not exactly clear that strategy is unwise or unsustainable. So it is also quite significant that when the High Commissioner, she gave her country statement, a member of the Sri Lankan delegation then went back to Sri Lanka, and an article came out in which that individual claimed, or was represented to have claimed, that the High Commissioner told him that she didn't agree with a lot of what was in the report and actually chastised members of her team for that. And OHHR and the High Commissioner immediately reacted and said, no, that's a mischaracterization or a misunderstanding, but that is not correct. But there was also soon after that, President Sarasena kind of disavowed some of the aspects of that resolution, and even when the resolution passed, members of the Sri Lankan delegation said they were not open to one of the pledges in it, which was the one on having foreign and commonwealth judges and lawyers and prosecutors participate. So when you have a situation where you have a country that's very engaged, but yet also it's clear that there's a disconnect between the kind of engagement that they want to demonstrate to the Council and then what they then tell their people and what kind of outreach they deliver to their people, and that disconnect is really problematic, I think, for everybody involved, and is not really how you start to build a transitional justice process, which really begins with outreach from the government and tone setting from the government. And so I think to talk about some steps forward, for starters, the Council is a critical body. It needs to continue to give support, and honestly, I mean, some of the recommendations that I would want to give, I can't give to the US, it's no longer at the table. But, I mean, to continue perhaps in supporting its partners and other allies who are at the table in making sure this stays on the agenda. It's also worth thinking about some other possibilities for keeping it at the table. I remember speaking to someone who talked about the possibility of perhaps another type of special procedure, but specifically looking at Sri Lanka. We have a historically low number of country-specific special procedures. It's difficult to do as country-specific anything at the Council, but it's not impossible, and especially given this sort of rich connection between the Council, the commitments, and human rights in Sri Lanka, it's not entirely impossible, and would be an interesting direction to explore. I think there are also other areas where the US is engaged with the UN that have an influence on Sri Lanka. The Peace Building Support Office, the Peace Building Fund, these are both engaged in Sri Lanka at the moment, and the US is in New York at the UN and can have an influence over how these processes, the strategy there, as well as on peacekeeping. The US does obviously have a relationship to the budget for peacekeeping, and peacekeeping is very important to Sri Lanka. So there are definitely some areas there in terms of supporting vetting practices and just general good security practices that the US could support in its capacity. I think it's also I would like to echo the other panelists, because I should probably have just waited to see if someone else would bring them up and then can just remind, but I completely agree on universal jurisdiction. I think looking at transitional justice, that is a very climbing trend. A lot of countries are using it. It's now being used by multiple countries in Europe to address the war crimes in Syria, and it was tried in South America against a Sri Lankan commander who was accused and who basically skipped town. But I think that kind of shows the significance, and it's not just useful in terms of certain targeted accountability, but it also demonstrates to the government that there are people who are interested in pursuing accountability, and kind of puts a little bit of pressure on them that if they do, they have to acknowledge that accountability will be sought, and it might be in their best interest to have a process where they are at least at the table and where they're there, and that there's some ownership over that process for them, as well as the Magnitsky Act, which is started out to tackle corruption, but is also something that's very high trending. I think it was just recently that the US used the act in terms of human rights abuses with Khashoggi in Saudi Arabia. And I think if the US is willing to use the Magnitsky Act to target a country that the US president has vociferously defended and cited as an ally, I think that really shows that this kind of targeted sanctioning is something that's politically very viable, because it does avoid targeting the state. It's demonstrating that it's putting sanctions on individuals who have been accused of connections to human rights abuses, and I see no reason why it could not be used in a wider format. I think it's also worth thinking about the one thing that so when I worked on Sri Lanka and when we had visited Sri Lanka that I never hear anyone talk about anymore, but I will raise it, is there were extensive consultations in Sri Lanka with Sri Lankans. One of the things that was pushed for by the Special Rapporteur at the time was that you cannot have a transitional justice process without buy-in from the population, and it needs to match the character, not just of the violations, but of the country and the culture in which it's implemented. So the Sri Lankan government was asked, very nicely, to carry out consultations in the country, and it basically turned it over to a group of civil society representatives who ended up doing just that and created this network of civil society throughout the entire island, and these extensive consultations. The consultations, it's the Consultations Task Force, the CTF, and its report is available on the SCRM website. And the reason I bring it up is because I think there's a lot of reluctance for states, and on good ground, to sort of insist on other states following certain blueprints for transitional justice. But there is actually available a lot of really interesting ideas by Sri Lankans, Tamil, Sinhala, basically from every group, that gave some ideas about what would be useful in the country. And I don't see that resource being used anymore, but it's one that I definitely think the government was given it, but does not appear to have applied it necessarily. And I think the US could absolutely make the case for the government taking another look at this document, or the US even taking a look at the document in thinking about what to support, because I think it is really important to acknowledge what people have expressed as their own, what they think would be really particularly useful for them. I would also say that when at the end of the Special Rapporteur's country visit to Sri Lanka, the title of the statement that was given is Sri Lanka continued to deny itself the benefits of transitional justice. And the reason why I kind of want to end with that line is because I think this is where there's a fundamental disconnect that continues to be really kind of hindering the process, is that you don't have, for transitional justice to really work, you really need the government to take it forward as a policy or a part of their platform. There really needs to be ownership, and not just ownership, but promotion of not just how essential this is, but how it's actually beneficial to the system as a whole and beneficial for all Sri Lankans. A process of reparations reinvests people back into the socio-economic and cultural fabric of a society that they feel isolated from following violations. This frees up and opens up an entire group back into the society. accountability, all processes of accountability end up having a great impact on the implies security sector reform, vetting, strengthening of the judicial processes. And there is no evidence that, I mean, every High Commissioner has noted that the judicial system in Sri Lanka continues to need revision at the very least, or at least some kind of reform. And I think that's one of the advantages of having a judicial process and accountability process. Transitional justice mechanisms are not just valuable in their own right, which they absolutely are, but they're kind of critical to reconstituting a country, so that when you have shocks, as you inevitably will, and as Sri Lanka has experienced, they do not respond with the same pathways to human rights violations that a country with a long legacy of cycles of violence will do. And so I think it's really important for the government of Sri Lanka, and for those who wish to not just pressure the government, but to support and really kind of push for the adoption of this as a policy and a platform, and a different behavior about how you approach it to the population, is that you can act. This is actually beneficial. It's difficult, but absolutely countries that have embarked on this have found considerable benefits to their system as a whole, that there hasn't been a sort of outreach or push about in the country, but we could absolutely benefit from. Because at the moment, transitional justice in Sri Lanka, while there are some great pushes on the Office of Missing Persons, although that continues to be not trusted by victims for very legitimate reasons in a country where there have been many other commissions before it that haven't been particularly successful. And it looks like the start of an Office of Reparations. These are great first steps, but you really need to have a coordinated policy that is communicated well to the population, including a population who need to understand how it will benefit them, as well as the communities who this is ultimately set up to assist. Because you cannot have transitional justice only defined well enough for people to use as a target for attacks, but not defined well enough for people to defend actively. Leaving it in this kind of gray area and seeing it as a series of checked boxes so that you can re-enter the international stage is kind of doomed to failure. So I think there are a lot of ways, not just to find other areas for accountability, but maybe to have a more concerted approach to the Sri Lankan government, looking at it more like this than asking it to fulfill a series of tasks, but more looking to the government to take this on as a concerted policy.
Thank you so much again for the caucus for inviting me to speak today. My colleague said something which I'll sort of pick up on, is sort of Sri Lanka needs to learn to be able to respond to shocks in a way that don't necessarily further perpetuate the types of human rights violations that we've seen in the past. And I'll sort of start off there, because obviously Sri Lanka has been in the news very recently, and we show our deepest sympathy with the victims and the families and all people of Sri Lanka for the recent terrorist attack. But unfortunately, we're starting to see areas of real concern with respect to human rights issues in response to the recent terrorist attack. Since the terrorist attack, and most recently the Sri Lankan government has imposed emergency regulations, which were passed last week. And one of those parts of the emergency regulations creates a ban on face veil, which risks stigmatizing Muslim women. And so they'll be forced, at a time when many Muslims right now are fearing backlash and persecution in response to the recent terrorist attack, imposing a ban that effectively targets women wearing a face veil for religious reasons, risks stigmatizing them. They'll be forced out of public spaces to stay at home and will be unable to work, study, or access basic services. We're also really much concerned with the extraordinary broad definition of terrorism, something that we very much clearly have seen before in the context of the Preventing Terrorism Act, and the powers to requisition property, which, as you all know, is very much similar to issues of land returns that have long plagued the country. In addition, we're very concerned about Clause 19 of these regulations, which allow for the detention of persons up to 1 year. Although they must be produced before a magistrate within 30 days, it leaves open a significant possibility of torture, which some of my other colleagues have demonstrated is a potential concern. Now, we're also concerned with respect to freedom of expression, because certain clauses allow, the death penalty, for example, to be prescribed to many offenses, including offenses like unlawful assembly. and there also a requirement to be confessions to a police officer above the rank of an ASP, which may be admissible in court. So, it's all to say that in times of crisis, it's important for the international community to obviously stand with the Sri Lankan government, provide assistance, but also for the Sri Lankan government to adhere to international human rights obligations and to not use the opportunity to further take steps backwards. But we're gathered here to really talk about sort of the reconciliation efforts that are undergoing in the country. And this briefing is obviously comes at a really important time, since it marks a decade since the end of the brutal war, but its long legacy of abuses still remain unaddressed. And then through decades of inaction, denial, and silencing, we have contributed to and exasperated a culture of impunity that protected perpetrators and at times have even promoted them. In the last 3 years, progress has moved towards meeting some of these commitments, but the pace has been slow, and the commitment to accountability for crimes committed during the war, one of the most important aspects of the Resolution 30-1, has been absent. And the glacial pace at which the government is handling the transitional justice process is telling of a lack of genuine political will to ensure victims of the decades-long civil war are provided with truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. Earlier this year, right before the Human Rights Council session, Amnesty International published a report which sort of provided a report card to the Sri Lankan government to how it was living up to many of its commitments. And we divided it up into 4 areas. 1 is truth, 2nd is justice, 3rd is reparations, and 4th is the issue of guarantees of non-recurrence. On the question of truth, the government committed to the creation of a commitment for truth, justice, reconciliation, and non-recurrence. And while legislation relating to that commission has been said to be approved by the cabinet, however, no bill has been made public. The lack of clarity and mandate and scope of that commission remains very much a question and area of concern for lots of human rights activists. And then there's a real question as to whether that commission will be allowed to grant amnesties. As you all know, under international law, amnesties cannot be given to people who commit massive crimes under international law. Now, in the Office of Missing Persons, some of my colleagues already spoke about it, but it has begun its operation in March 13th of 2018, and it has released an interim report. And one of while the OMP bill was being drafted, one of the concerns that Amnesty International raised that it failed to actually take into account was issues of gender sensitization for the staff, who are the membership that make the OMP, the security of the tenure of members, and most recently the appointment of the major paras has been a really troubling signal with respect to the OMP. The lack of Tamil speakers is also another area that many people have criticized with the implementation of the OMP, and really particularly this sort of culture of lack of effective implementation and sensitivity over the issue has been a real insult to many of the victims of the Civil War. And while the interim report was submitted in September 5th of last year, it highlighted the challenges that the office is actually facing, whether it's lack of support by the Sri Lankan government, or the legislation that is necessary to create reforms with the government, with the office, and administrative challenges that it's facing overall with conducting its business. Then when it comes to justice, this is an area in which the government has really not made any progress. We've actually, and some of my colleagues mentioned this, key members of the Sri Lankan government have actually backtracked with respect to the importance of participation in a Sri Lankan judicial mechanism. In 2016, we saw President Sirisena stated that he will never agree to international involvement in the matter. At UNGA, he, in front of the entire international community, spoke in the context of sovereignty and non-interference in the issue of Sri Lanka, which many, particularly the domestic media, saw as him reinforcing that any Commonwealth or foreign judges were sort of backtracking on his commitments on those issues. And in Geneva, there was the removed charges against groups only proves that there's a lack of political will to further investigations when it comes to justice issues. And we've also seen the same from the Prime Minister's office, who said that hybrid courts are not feasible, and has raised issues which are not true about the constitutionality of these courts. Now, on questions of reparations, we've seen legislation relating to the Office for Reparations, which was approved in October 2018. And we have seen applications for the appointment of members of the Office of Reparations, which were advertised in January of this year. However, there still remains concerns over the power and decision-making authority of the office, and that everything must be approved by the cabinet prior to adoption. So there's real concerns with the independence and effectiveness of this new office that was created. Under reparations, it's obviously the subject of land returns, which some of my colleagues have highlighted. The fact that the government continues to occupy large portions of land in the north and the east of Sri Lanka means that this issue continues to be unmet and sort of not fulfilled by the Sri Lankan government. And the fact that even though there were some land that were returned, the fact that they were arbitrarily and there's a lack of transparency over how that process is undergoing shows that this piecemeal approach is actually not fulfilling its sort of commitment to remedies to many of the victims of the Civil War. Now, on the question of guarantees of non-recurrence, the issue of the Prevention of Terrorism Act comes up a lot. While the government has committed to the repeal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, 3 years later the act is yet to be repealed. The proposed replacement, the counterterrorism bill, has many flaws with respect to its accordance with international law, standards, and the best practice, as there are serious concerns with the legislation within the community. We also have focused in this report the issue of witness protection, and while there was a passage of a new witness and victim protection law, the implementation has been very much problematic. There's questions about its independence and effectiveness to actually protect the victim, and many of the victims, while some have actually asked for there to be witnesses to be met in other governments, the Sri Lankan government has refused to do so, forcing them to either speak in diplomatic consulates or embassies abroad, which really brings into question the security for many of the witnesses and victims who would like to testify on this issue. Now, I'll speak a little bit about what Congress's role. As I mentioned, in my previous capacity, I worked for 5 years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and very much worked on Sri Lanka policy. The two areas that I've seen Sri Lanka policy has moved forward is one in the appropriations bill. There are just for FY18 and now for FY19 there has been certification that for any assistance given to the central government of Sri Lanka, that there has to be certain criteria met, and these criteria fall in the area of accountability and transparency in the governments, repealing laws like the PTA, investigating allegations of arbitrary arrest, the returning of military occupied lands, and so forth. Now, of course, these certifications, the actual certification in the report that proceeded afterwards has not been made public, so I think this is an area in which Congress can sort of further inquire to the Appropriations Committee. I also, as you all know, these certifications have to be renewed every year. And so, one possible avenue for Congress is to make a standalone legislation that would make these certifications a requirement for assistance moving forward. The other area that is also very concerning, though, is the increase of Sri Lanka within the National Defense Authorization under its Maritime Security Assistance Package. And while there have been, we've noted concerns from the USG in terms of working with the Army, and they've tried to distinguish working with some security forces versus others. Clearly, during the Civil War, there were reports of naval officers also being, complicit in some of the crimes as well. And so, and also just the signal of a deepening, U.S.-Sri Lanka military relationship in the face of a lack of accountability and a lack of truth and reconciliation sends a very worrying signal about the priority that the U.S. has when it comes to actually addressing these issues. We very much echo my colleagues' concern with respect to the U.S. withdrawal of the Human Rights Council and the impact that that's had in our ability to lead on this issue. At the same time, I think that there's opportunities given though, some of them were talked about in other UN mechanisms, but as well as whether it's hosting side events or making sure there's still a lot of pressure that can be placed on other Human Rights Council members to make sure that that there is its commitments are actually followed through. And while we certainly wouldn't want to be in the same situation 2 years from now, one of the things that was positive in this most recent approval or sort of introduction of the resolution and passage was that it called for a timetabled steps to accountability, to truth and reconciliation. Now, we don't know what that timetable is, and so I think one area for Congress to really ask the administration, to ask the international community, is to really sort of set that timetable for the Sri Lankan government and with all the powers that it can. And obviously Congress has diplomacy and its own powers, whether it's leading delegations to Sri Lanka, whether it's meeting with the Sri Lankan ambassador to really make this a high profile issue within the bilateral relationship, because unfortunately I worry that other issues such as whether it's now counterterrorism or whether it's the rise of China, unfortunately have made this issue fall in less and less on the priority issue, and so Congress has a real role to play to change that. So I'll end my remarks there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for holding this. And I'm Sri Lankan, and my name is Angelica Silva. I've lived in the United States for 35 years, but I have been very much in touch with Sri Lanka and served both this country and Sri Lanka. Listening to you, I get the impression that there's a total focus on the minorities in Sri Lanka and absolutely, well, I need to give you my background. I'm born and raised a Buddhist, educated in Catholic school. I taught in a Muslim school, and I sing in the Catholic Church. So if there's diversity that reflects Sri Lanka, that's me, and that's what I have seen in Sri Lanka. I go to Sri Lanka several times a year, and I would like to clear some impressions about Sri Lanka, because to be quite honest, in simple terms, I feel that over this the war, and we are now 10 years after the war, and whatever happened before, and there's a selective approach where both sides of the story are not getting told. And there's a constant reference to minority rights in Sri Lanka, but not any reference to the global picture. So let me tell you that what looks like a majority in Sri Lanka, which are the Singhala people, there are 17 million in the whole world. So they are a world minority. And it's true, Sri Lanka is very diverse. We have diverse religions, we have diverse ethnicities. And when I go to Sri Lanka, and I have my finger on a lot of information. Like for instance, if you take the top millionaires in the country, the top 20 millionaires and the richest people, 6 of them are from minority communities. And I didn't see anything that there was a reference made to lack of opportunities for minorities. I didn't see that, because I took out the newspaper of the Financial Times and heading companies. There's a huge proportion of the minorities leading companies. If you take the professions, if you take the universities where education is free, there is a disproportionate number of positions for free education in engineering, medical studies, university education, where the majority is actually a minority in making use of those privileges, right? And so I want these committees that speak about Sri Lanka to pay attention to the fact that the majority that you refer to, and I have seen a lot of references to the predominantly Singhala government, the predominantly Singhala army, and whatever. Remember, in our military and security services, we have the minority ethnicities represented, but for convenience, they are not brought out into focus. So when you look at Sri Lanka, there are 17 million people who cannot identify with any other country in the world who are trying to protect that country. Now, if you take the other minorities, like the Tamil people, there's about probably 1.5 to 2 million. It's about 12% to 75%. They identify with 70 million people in Tamil Nadu, which is swimming distance from Sri Lanka. They identify themselves with religion, the language they speak, and everything. And then the Muslim community, we have had a lot of connections with them. I myself taught in a Muslim school. The Sunni Muslims have a problem because of the radicalization, and they themselves are suffering inside the country because our Muslim friends have told me about the fact that they fear for this radicalization even within Sri Lanka. So there are wheels within wheels, but in all of this, the big picture, all I'm hearing is very anti the majority in Sri Lanka, which is actually a world minority in the world, right?
Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt. Did you have a specific question for the panel?
Yeah, no, but I was trying to clear the air about this because there has to be. So what I want to know is, have you all actually been studying the data that will tell you whether you can validate some of these statements that people are not getting opportunities? How do you validate those statements? And you made a reference to the land that's not being given back, and now I know that keeping up with what's happening, 88.7% of the state lands have been given back, and about 90%. So are you all validating this data? That is my question. How are you all using the data to make these assumptions on Sri Lanka? And the other thing I want to say is, the current situation has unearthed a lot of very up-to-date information about the security, and true, we admit there were security lapses, but there have been instances where leading up to the Easter attack, there was 20 temples, Buddhist temples attacked and vandalized, right? And there's a huge festival coming up. Are you all monitoring this information, where the next attacks were planned for, which the security forces are coming up with? And
Okay,
at a
ma'am,
time like
could we
this,
please allow the panel to answer your questions that you've asked?
yes, so please answer whether you all are actually looking into the relevance of the data before you make sweeping statements.
The casualty figures from 1983 to 2009 is in excess of 100,000 people. The United Nations investigation in 2015 found, in fact, just to backtrack from there, the panel of experts in 2012 concluded that if there were credible allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. In 2015, report of the OISL concluded that war crimes and crimes against humanity have taken place. Those are facts. Those are absolutely supported by social science research. That's supported by testimony given by individuals. Many of them, some of them I represented, and I know others in the room have represented. They're very credible conclusions. It's also a fact that not a single person has been held to account within the island of Sri Lanka for any of these crimes. Those are facts as well. And I think while we can try to talk about revisionist history, it's also important to understand that what we're talking about today, after the end of the war, 10 years after the end of the war, is that there's been very little movement towards accountability. And the reason accountability is essential, not just in Sri Lanka, it's in fact essential around the world, is that if you do not hold people to account for what they have done, what they have, in some instances, what they failed to do, because states have some legal obligations as well, is that you enable the other state to do the same thing to their citizens. Right now, as we speak right now, there are 900,000 people in Rohingyas who are in camps in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. Some of them have been there. This is the 4th time they've actually gone there since the 50s. The reason is the region itself has been immune from the level of accountability that is required of state actors. And I think, the point here is that unless and until Sri Lanka embraces this and accepts that, it needs to hold people to account for its failures and for these crimes committed, it's very hard to move forward. It's very hard to move forward. And then I'm not getting into discussion or an argument here. I'm going to just give you what the facts are. It is very difficult for this country to move forward in any meaningful way. The issues of religious minorities is a fundamental fact. The Constitution of Sri Lanka is constituted in a way that Buddhism is the official religion of the state, and perhaps that's okay with you, but I don't believe that you can build a pluralistic society when you have one religion that is seen as the official state religion, and all others, are second or third tier religions. I don't think you build harmony by doing that. So it's important that while there may be a view that there's a minority complex, from an international context, it's important that I think Sri Lanka needs to really understand its obligations. It needs to understand the internal dynamics that have led to where this country that had enormous potential 30, 40 years ago has squandered, and in fact, I would say most people of Sri Lanka should be really angry because it squandered the opportunity for economic prosperity, for leadership in the region, because it has fundamentally some of the most important social economic indicators as measurable to humans. So I think people need to wonder why it hasn't achieved those benchmarks with the strength it has, because there's been disharmony amongst its people, and it's a fundamental fact that needs to be dealt with.
As a lawyer,
And I'm not arguing with you.
As a lawyer, when you talk about state players, why are non-state players not being held accountable for all the deaths that happen with suicide bombings and things like that? Why non-state players are not taken to task? I mean,
Well, that's our
guys are-
responsibility of the state. It's, private actors cannot prosecute, violations by non-state actors. So if there is impunity for violations committed by non-state actors, that's also a responsibility of the state. My report was exclusively about torture, because that was my mandate, and my testimony today is about that. And it is based on literally dozens of interviews, chosen at random, of people in custody and not in custody, and without making any distinction about their minority or majority status in the community. My mandate did not extend to discrimination, so I'm not talking about that, but I can say that in terms of the severity and the gravity of some of the torture mechanisms and measures that I witnessed, that I recorded, there is a definite ethnic discrimination component to it as well, especially because the torture seemed to be a lot more serious, a lot more grievous, if there was a perceived national security component to it. And inevitably in Sri Lanka and elsewhere, especially in countries that have different communities in their midst, the national security impression also relates to the ethnicity and the minority status of people. So although I didn't, when I interviewed people, I didn't ask them whether they were Tamil or Sinhalese, and what I said about the lack of guarantee system applies both to, well, not both, but to all members of Sri Lankan society.
Do any of you have ideas as to why the government seemed to be so resistive to any kind of meaningful change? That it seems as though it operates a little like the Watutsi. That's a dance we used to do. You make 2 steps forward, then you make 2 steps back. And even though you're moving, you remain pretty much in the same place. I mean, you haven't gone anywhere. That seems to be my understanding of the situation and how it goes. We have any feeling about why the government seems to just refuse to move?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that and say that the one step back it takes is we've seen most prevalent is on accountability, which is is one of the most important pieces of that victims have really called for, and so that one step really starts to dismantle any sense of truth, justice, and reparations. In terms of why, we think it's a real failure of political will for the Sri Lankan government. In our discussion with them, and also in discussions here with the ambassador, and every time that the issues come up, it's because they say that they're politically not able to really hold to account former armed forces who committed crimes under international law. And so similar to how, unfortunately, how the debate here plays out with respect to the International Criminal Court, it's a false equivalency, but to compare the two, but it's unfortunately all comes back to a lack of political will to make meaningful reforms on justice, on accountability, and on human rights issues. So.
May I respond to your question?
I don't know if other members of the on the panel want to answer the question first. Sorry.
To start, I think that, firstly, for those who are interested, there is a wealth of information available through the UN system. For example, there has been a country report pretty much every year through the High Commissioner from extensive data and in collaboration with the government, the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, which Sri Lanka has considerable submissions from civil society and other UN actors. Civil society groups in Sri Lanka, such as the Center for Policy Alternatives, have made a lot of things public. There is a wealth of information out there that continue to give those who are following Sri Lanka at the Human Rights Council and elsewhere a lot of cause for concern. And I think part of this 2 steps forward, 1 steps back issue as well is I think this is falling, in a lot of countries who do transitional justice fall into this trap as well, but is actually this issue of a sort of seeing it as a not being able to convince the population that this isn't a competition between one group and another group. And this is very common in a lot of countries, but I think even the discussion here kind of indicates that there hasn't been a concerted effort to demonstrate that the significance of combating impunity and instigating the kind of reforms that would guarantee a non-recurrence of violence. And anyone familiar with the history of the country knows that this violence has touched every single community to different degrees, but nonetheless, similar types of violence in a variety of communities all over the island in the history of the country. And I don't think that, because it's happened to one community more recently, is no reason to assume that it's not a persistent problem for everybody. And I think part of this, I think there may be concerns in the government about appealing to a certain constituency and some insecurity that constituency is not, insecurity about whether that constituency will support them. But I would argue that, it's part of having a government that is reactive to what it thinks public opinion will be is not a government that can lead very well in terms of, you should have the government shaping public opinion and demonstrating that this does not have to be a competition, that transitional justice and commitments to international accountability and human rights is actually making the entire, has significant advantages to every segment of the population, not just to a single minority, given the kind of changes in terms of civilian control over the military and security sector reform and all of these different processes which will benefit, all Sri Lankans. So I think the insecurity that the government might be feeling, which may be causing it to be very cautious in how it proceeds, is actually insecurity that it itself has a responsibility to overcome for the population, not the other way around.
Thank you all very much for being here. On behalf of Congressman Johnson, unfortunately we have to wrap up the hearing. We have to give the room back, and very appreciative to all of our speakers here today for your great testimony.